For the longest time, I've wanted to know just how much each version of Windows impacts the performance of certain programs. For the following set of tests, I'll use an 800 MHz Pentium 3 with 512 MB of RAM and a Voodoo 3 3000 on one system, and the other system will have a 1.5 GHz Pentium 4, 1 GB of RAM, and a GeForce 2 Ultra, the Dell Dimension 8100 of course. Let's start by playing a time demo in WinQuake, the Win32 version of Quake which uses software rendering. As with all other upcoming game benchmarks, these were run at a resolution of 1024x768. Obviously, you'll want to play at a lower resolution on old systems as software rendering will demand a lot of effort on the CPU's end to render each frame. Pentium 3 benchmarks consistently land around 23 to 25 frames per second across all Windows versions, but for the Pentium 4, the NT family of operating systems, being NT4, 2000, and XP, run at only about 30 frames per second. The 9X family, on the other hand, renders much faster, topping out at 44 frames on Windows 98. I'm not sure what's the cause of this, but there's plenty more cases where the 9X and NT families stand out differently, due to their differing underlying architectures. GL Quake reveals some interesting results. Most versions have largely the same results except for Windows 95. When using OpenGL rendering in Windows 95A, the frame rate always caps at 60 frames per second, possibly due to forced vertical sync. If you want OpenGL support in Windows 95A, in many cases you'll have to find a copy of OpenGL32.dll and add it to the system directory yourself. Windows 95B, on the other hand, natively supports OpenGL, and AGP functionality can be added with the USB supplement. However, the Pentium 4's Intel A50 chipset driver doesn't seem to support the AGP bus in this version, hence a drastically lower frame rate compared to the rest of the versions. The same pattern can be seen in Quake 2. Keep in mind that I did use the default OpenGL renderer for the Voodoo 3. I forgot to install an updated MiniGL driver to get the 3dFX renderer to work. Even if Windows 95 can't support the AGP bus for any reason, you can still use an AGP card. It'll just function as a PCI card instead, constrained to PCI bandwidth. You might notice in most of the OpenGL game benchmarks, Windows XP scores a lower frame rate than the bulk of the other Windows versions for the Pentium 3. This is almost certainly due to the additional background processes which run by default. Disabling unnecessary services may resolve the issue a bit. The Pentium 4 can handle playing many games on Windows XP without any noticeable performance loss. It's rather striking to see that Windows NT 4 returns a higher frame rate than any other version, specifically for Quake 3 Arena. A good handful of versions of Windows can handle glide rendering easily. If you happen to have a 3dFX card, it'll go with Unreal like bread and butter, as you can see from these results. Most Windows versions approach 60 frames per second at 1024x768. Getting Unreal's OpenGL renderer to work with the GeForce 2 Ultra was a different story though. In most cases, loading the OpenGL renderer outright crashed the game, and the few instances I got it working felt like it was all by dumb luck. I was forced to use the Direct3D renderer, which proved to be a huge disappointment. Using this renderer, Unreal was effectively unplayable on Windows 95, and I could not test this game on Windows NT 4 due to its very limited DirectX support, going up to version 3. Of course, Unreal Tournament Game of the Year Edition is slower due to its graphical improvements over the original Unreal, but this time the OpenGL renderer works. Unlike with the other OpenGL games, these Pentium 4 benchmarks hardly stand out from each other. I expected the later versions of Windows to make good use of the AGP bus, but then again, this game does recommend the Direct3D renderer over the OpenGL one. Serious Sam the First Encounter takes us back to the original pattern. Windows XP is slower on older systems, and Windows 95 may be constrained by a lack of AGP support or forced vertical sync. When it comes to gaming, Windows 95A isn't sufficiently equipped to handle all the hardware which later games demand, and Windows XP will hold you back quite a bit if your hardware can't keep up with it. 3D Mark 99 Max seems to cap at 60 frames per second regardless of what settings I adjust in the driver controls and benchmark settings. The only clear difference between the versions of Windows in which 3D Mark 99 Max was tested lies in the CPU marks. 3D Mark 99 Max makes use of Pentium 3 optimizations on Windows 98, but not on Windows 95. As for the 3D Mark 2000 results, there is a lot more variation between the 4 later versions I was able to test. Windows 98 2nd Edition scored the highest on both computers, and Windows 2000 returned a drastically lower score than the rest of the versions on the Pentium 4. I like to know what bogged it down so much. It almost feels like it has to do with the specific hardware I used, but I had switched to a different sound card before running all the benchmarks on Windows 2000 and ME, because the previous one had drivers for those 2 versions that constantly ate up 25% of the CPU. Ideally, you'll want to go with Windows 98 2nd Edition for the perfect blend of broad compatibility with old and new software and a small footprint on older computers. Of course, Windows isn't just used for games. Workstation software is also important, and there has to be a reason why someone would switch to a Windows NT based operating system besides the enhanced business-oriented networking and security capabilities, as well as the superior stability of each and every program which runs on Windows NT. I'll run a few programs running the same task on 8 versions of Windows and determine which one is fastest simply by measuring how much time each one takes to complete. When it comes to CPU-intensive creative software from developers like Autodesk and Adobe, Windows NT 4 really shines through in most of the benchmarks. The underlying architecture of the Windows NT family appears to be much better at handling 32-bit operations than their Windows 9X counterparts. If you happen to have a Windows 98 system with Photoshop or 3ds Max installed and you decided to upgrade it to Windows XP later on, it would in fact have made your computer faster in that perspective, provided it had plenty of RAM installed. Windows 2000 offers similar levels of performance compared to Windows NT 4, but also provides several advantages like native USB and FAT32 support, as well as better compatibility with comparably recent programs. While Windows XP is still a bit slower than the other NT-based operating systems, the gap shrinks with faster systems. Windows 95 may have a faster, more lightweight interface than the later versions of Windows, but one could say that doesn't help much based on these tests. The time it takes to complete a render or filter remains very similar between each Windows 9X version. However, these tests don't take systems with smaller RAM installations into account. Most users of the day had to deal with such memory limitations and swapping, so in a future presentation, I'll test some low memory configurations to see just how much they affect a computer's speed, and if using older versions of Windows compensates for the lack of abundant memory.